The rain had fallen nonstop for 3 days. The river that cut through the Taringwa Nature Reserve was flowing with a force no one there had seen in years. The banks overflowed, and the mud-colored water swallowed everything it found in its path: logs, bushes, and any animal unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's exactly what happened to Beao. The cub was only 4 months old. He didn't yet understand much about the world beyond the scent of his mother and the warmth of the pride. That morning, he wandered a little beyond the shade of the acacias while the adults rested. A landslide near the embankment startled the group, and in the chaos of the moment, Beao slipped down the muddy slope straight into the river. The current pulled him as if he were a dry branch. His mother, Rena, ran to the water's edge and roared with an intensity that echoed throughout the reserve. The other lions in the group arrived right behind her, but none entered. The current was too strong, and even the adults knew that going in there was signing their own death warrant. They watched helplessly as the cub struggled, his head rising and falling between the murky waves. 400 meters away, in an elevated stretch of dense forest, a gorilla named Kondo heard the noise. Kondo was 11 years old and had been living alone for nearly 2. He was not new to the reserve. He had grown up there, knew every trail, every scent, every sound out of place. And that specific sound, that roar mixed with a high-pitched cry of a cub, was not something easily ignored. He slowly stood up, tilted his head to the side, and remained still for a few seconds. Then he began walking toward the river. What Kondo would do upon arriving there, no one could predict. And what would come after that, even less. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave in the comments what you thought, and which city or country you were watching from. When Kondo reached the riverbank, the scene was chaotic. The brown, foamy water was tearing chunks of the embankment away with frightening ease. Beao was trapped between 2 slime-covered rocks about 12 meters from shore, his head barely above the surface, his front paws scraping uselessly against the stone. And the pride was on the other side. Rena didn't stop roaring. There were 4 more adults with her: a young male named Drago, 2 females, and an older lion who stayed a bit back, as if he had already calculated that there was nothing to be done. Rena's gaze jumped from her son to Kondo the moment the gorilla appeared among the bushes. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds. Drago took a step forward, baring his teeth. It was a reflex, not a decision. Gorilla on the opposite bank, cub in danger, tension in the air. Instinct made him react before his brain could process anything. Rena, however, did not move. She looked at Kondo in a different way. It wasn't trust. It was desperation trying to find anything that wasn't her son's death. Kondo didn't look at the lions for long. His eyes went straight to Beao. The cub was losing strength. Each passing wave covered his head for a second longer than the last. The rocks keeping him in place were the same ones injuring his paws every time he tried to steady himself. It was a matter of minutes. The gorilla went down the embankment slowly, testing the ground with his knuckles before putting his weight on it. The mud gave way beneath him, but he was heavy enough to keep his balance. When he reached the edge of the water, the current splashed his face. He stopped. There was something in that moment of hesitation that no camera captured, because there were no cameras. Only the forest, the fine rain still falling, and a gorilla looking at a lion cub that was dying. What was going through Kondo's mind at that moment is something no one will ever be able to answer for certain. But what he did next changed everything. Kondo stepped into the water. It wasn't a dive. It wasn't a heroic leap. It was a slow, calculated entry, like someone who knows exactly the size of the risk they are taking. The first step sank up to his knee, the second up to his waist. The current pushed with a force that would have knocked down a smaller animal. But Kondo weighed more than 180 kilos, and each step was secured before the next. On the opposite bank, Drago stopped growling. Rena became completely still, her eyes fixed on the gorilla advancing into the river toward her son. It was a kind of paralysis that didn't come from fear, but from something she had probably never experienced before. The feeling of watching a stranger do what she herself couldn't. The water at the stretch of rocks reached Kondo's chest. The current there was treacherous because it hit the rocks and created unpredictable whirlpools. He slipped once, his right knee hitting the rocky bottom, but he held on with his left hand to a protruding rock before being dragged away. He stayed still for a few seconds, breathing deeply, regaining his balance. Beao saw him approaching and reacted with the only resource he still had. He tried to move away. The instinct of a cub in the presence of a large and unknown animal is always the same, no matter the situation. He scratched at the rock, trying to retreat, which nearly threw him into the stronger current. Kondo made a low sound. It wasn't a roar, nor an aggressive grunt. It was something closer to the sound a mother gorilla makes when she wants a baby to stop moving. A short, deep vibration, almost inaudible over the noise of the water. Beao stopped. For a few seconds, the two looked at each other from less than a meter apart. The exhausted cub, his head trembling from the effort to stay above the surface. The gorilla steady among the rocks, the water foaming around his broad torso. Then Kondo extended his arm. He wrapped the cub with one hand with a care that seemed rehearsed, but wasn't. It was simply the only way to do it without hurting him. He turned his body sideways to cut through the current more easily and began the return. The return was harder than the way in. With Beao pressed against his chest, Kondo had only one arm free to keep his balance. The current took advantage of every second of instability. Halfway across, a larger wave pushed them sideways and Kondo lost contact with the bottom for a moment. Enough of the water to drag them about 3 meters before he managed to plant his foot on a submerged rock and stop the movement. Beao didn't struggle. He stayed still against the gorilla's body, as if some part of him understood that fighting now would be the final mistake. When Kondo finally reached the bank and placed the cub on the mud, he himself dropped to his knees. He had a deep cut on his right thigh where the rock had scraped during the fall, and the effort against the current had cost more than it seemed. He stayed there, supported on his hands, breathing heavily, his head lowered. Beao was alive. Weak, soaked, trembling, but alive. That was when the situation turned in a way no one expected. Drago crossed the river through the shallow stretch further upstream and reached the bank where Kondo was in less than 2 minutes. Then came the 2 females. Lastly, Rena. They approached the exhausted gorilla who was still on his knees in the mud, unable to react in time if anything happened. What came next seemed to stop time. Rena passed the others, reached Kondo, and stopped less than half a meter from him. The gorilla slowly raised his eyes. There was no way to know what she would do. Logic said one thing. The situation said another. She lowered her head. It wasn't a trained gesture or a coincidence of posture. It was slow, deliberate, and lasted long enough to leave no doubt about what it meant. Drago stood still. The female stood still. No teeth bared, no roar, no advance. Kondo looked at Beao, who was suckling frantically from his mother a few meters behind, and then looked at Rena, still with her head inclined toward him. The forest was completely silent. Something was happening there that went beyond any explanation of territory, hierarchy, or instinct. It was the kind of moment that nature rarely allows, and when it does happen, no one who witnesses it can properly describe it afterward. The lions stayed on the bank for almost an hour. They didn't surround Kondo. They didn't threaten him. They simply stayed there, as if they needed to be sure he was okay before leaving. Rena was the one who looked in his direction the most. Beao, already regaining his strength, tried to approach the gorilla twice and was redirected by his mother with a gentle touch on the neck. When they finally left, it was without haste. They disappeared into the dense vegetation as if the rain had washed away any boundary that existed before. Kondo remained alone on the bank for a long time. The cut on his thigh stopped bleeding on its own. He licked the wound, slowly got up, and climbed back to the elevated area where he lived. There was nothing dramatic in his movements. He didn't look back. It was as if what he had done was simply the thing that needed to be done, and that was it. 3 weeks later, a group of researchers monitoring wildlife in the Terrangwa Reserve reviewed footage from a camera trap installed near the river. The camera had captured only the final moments: Kondo coming out of the water with Beao in his arm, the lions on the bank, and the scene of Rena lowering her head. The footage circulated among the researchers before anyone else saw it. One of them, who had been studying animal behavior for 17 years, said in a later interview that it contradicted everything he would have bet would happen in that situation. It wasn't just the rescue that challenged scientific explanation. It was the pride's response. Animals don't give thanks. That's the version we learn. They react, calculate, survive. But what Rena did on that muddy bank, in front of an exhausted gorilla who saved her son, didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. Maybe nature is more complex than the labels we put on it. Maybe empathy is not a human privilege. Maybe, in extreme moments, something more fundamental than species or instinct comes into play, something that has no scientific name, but that anyone who has ever helped someone without expecting anything in return immediately recognizes. Kondo didn't know any of that. He just saw a cub drowning and stepped into the water. Sometimes that's all it takes. If you made it this far, leave in the comments what you thought of this story and which city or country you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.